The piranhas were feeding.
Severina could tell by the way the surface shattered into tiny explosions, silver flashes like coins being thrown, the sound of 100 small mouths tearing at something no longer recognizable as whatever it used to be. She dipped her paddle into the Jurua, 3 meters left of the feeding frenzy, and pushed her canoe forward without changing speed. 68 years old, arms ropey with muscle that refused to acknowledge her age, and she crossed Piranha water every morning with the same casual focus a city woman might give to crossing a busy street. Watch. Move with purpose. Don't splash. Don't bleed. People who didn't live on the river thought piranhas attacked on sight, some mindless feeding machine that stripped flesh from bone the moment it smelled blood. Television did that. Documentaries with breathless narration and underwater cameras positioned 2 centimeters from the teeth. The truth was simpler and more dangerous for being misunderstood. Piranhas were opportunists, smart ones. They tested water temperature, current speed, the size of potential prey versus the effort required. A healthy person paddling through a school of red-bellied piranha was in about as much danger as a person walking through a flock of pigeons. But a person bleeding, thrashing, someone who'd capsized into warm, shallow water where the fish were already agitated from a feeding event, that was different. Severina's second son, Valdemar, learned that lesson 22 years ago. Capsized canoe, cut on his forearm from the gunnel, warm water, a school already feeding on a dead caiman 50 meters upstream. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. She still fished these waters every single morning. Because Valdemar died from ignorance, not from piranhas. If he'd known what she knew, stay still, don't splash, keep wounds above the waterline, don't thrash. He'd have sat on that overturned canoe and waited, and he'd be alive to fight with her about it right now. The knowledge was the difference. And Severina had spent 22 years making sure she knew everything. Lizio appeared behind her in a dugout so small it barely qualified as a boat, more of a floating seat with edges. 10 years old, dark-skinned, wire-thin, with the same wide-set eyes that Valdemar had. He paddled with the careless efficiency of a child who'd learned to swim at 3 and been climbing in and out of canoes since before he could walk. Severina's hands tightened on her paddle. The boy, in a canoe, in piranha water, alone. The familiar cold swept through her chest. Not fear exactly, something older and heavier. The weight of knowing what the river could do pressed against the weight of watching her grandson drift toward it. Licio Ferreira, you get back to that house right now. What did I tell you about the canoe? What did I tell you? The boy's face didn't flinch. He'd heard this tone before, daily, any time he came near the water without supervision. He held up the bucket. 8 minnows swam inside, silver and frantic. Severina cut him off with a look that could have curdled the river. Her daughter, Orquidea, had opinions about things she hadn't earned the right to comment on. Memory, age. Whether a 68-year-old woman should be crossing piranha water alone every dawn. The bait bucket, though, she had forgotten it. Second time this week. She took the bucket from his canoe, transferring minnows without spilling, a motion so practiced it happened in her sleep, and pointed her paddle toward the stilt house visible through morning haze. Go back. Now, Licio turned his dugout around, slowly, with exaggerated obedience that told Severina he wasn't obeying, he was performing. He paddled 20 meters, drifted, paddled 10 more. She watched until she couldn't watch anymore without losing the morning's fishing window. The piranhas were still feeding. And where piranhas fed, the big fish gathered after. Tucunare, tambaqui, pirarucu. Predators that knew a frenzy attracted smaller fish to the edges, the way a dropped meal attracts scavengers. Smart fishers worked the outside. Let the piranhas concentrate the prey, harvest the edges. Severina passed the frenzy's border and waited. The river moved around her canoe like breath around a sleeping body. Warm, constant, deceptively gentle. Behind her, Licio's dugout had stopped moving. She didn't notice. She was focused on the water, on the piranhas, whose behavior she could read like text. But the boy wasn't heading home. He'd tucked his canoe behind a half-submerged mahogany trunk and was watching her technique with an intensity that burned brighter than the equatorial sun now clearing the tree line. 3 days later, Severina woke to an empty hammock across the room. Licio's hammock, the one he slept in every night since Orquídea sent him upriver for flood season. Double shifts at the fish processing plant in Tefe. Flood season not something you handled alone with a 10-year-old. The boy's paddle was gone. His dugout, gone from the porch tether. And the bait bucket she'd filled the night before with minnows for the morning run. Gone. 5:15 in the morning. Sun not up. The Vasia wrapped in pre-dawn grey, where everything looked like the ghost of itself. And her grandson was somewhere out there, in a canoe built for calm water, in a river that had killed fishermen with decades more experience than he'd been alive. Severina didn't panic. Panic killed people on the river. Shaky hands, loud breathing, sloppy movements. She pulled on boots, grabbed her paddle and the long-handled gaff she used for pirarucu. Stepped into her canoe with the steady precision of a woman who'd done this 8,000 mornings in a row. She knew where he'd gone. The boy was observant, something worse than reckless. He'd watched her spots for weeks. The bend near the old rubber station, the deep pool past the cemetery, and the frenzy point, where the feeding happened, where she worked the edges, where the biggest catches were. The frenzy point. That's where he'd go. Because that's where the most impressive fish gathered, and Licio was 10, and 10-year-old boys didn't think about danger. They thought about proving something to the person who kept telling them they weren't ready.
The boy went to the frenzy point.
Tiberio. Old rival, older friend. Sat on his porch in the grey light with a coffee and 3 missing fingers on his left hand. Souvenirs from a piranha bite in '92 that he described differently every telling. Sometimes 10 fish, sometimes 30. The fingers were always the same 3. 20 minutes. Small dugout. Child's paddle. That put him near the frenzy point already. Severina didn't answer. She drove her paddle into the water and surged east with the stroke rhythm she used when something was wrong. Deep, full-body pulls that sent the canoe cutting through current like something predatory. Piranhas were already feeding when she reached the frenzy point. Water boiling silver, that frantic, wet, tearing sound filling the air alongside screeching birds diving for scraps. And there, 30 meters past the frenzy's outer edge, Licio's tiny dugout sat motionless. The boy had a line in the water, sitting perfectly still, back straight, hands steady, eyes locked on the surface, the way Severina's were when she worked. No splashing, no sudden movements. Bait positioned exactly where she would have placed it, outside the frenzy radius, in the calm water where opportunistic feeders circled.
He'd been watching.
Not just the what, the where, the how, the exact distance that separated productive fishing from dangerous proximity.
His line jerked.
He set the hook with a wrist snap that was pure instinct. Nobody taught him that timing, and hauled up a tucunare that flashed gold and green. Fat, maybe 2 kilograms. He grabbed it behind the gills, avoided the dorsal spines, laid it in the bilge. One smooth sequence. Severina stopped paddling, drifted, watched her grandson fish her exact technique, and do it well. That's when the caimans surfaced. Not a big one, 1.5 meters, a juvenile. It came up between the dugout and the frenzy, armored back, breaking the water in a slow roll. The piranhas, scattered from its path, regrouped, kept feeding. The caiman wasn't interested in piranhas. It was interested in the fish blood leaking from Licchio's bilge. The tucunare still bleeding from the gills, sending a thin, red invitation into the current.
Avo?
His voice carried. Thin, young, a 10-year-old who just realized the gap between watching danger from a distance and sitting in the middle of it. The caiman was 6 meters from his canoe, the dugout small enough that a motivated juvenile could tip it with a tail swipe. Severina's paddle hit the water before the fear in her chest had time to become anything louder than instinct. She drove alongside his canoe, not between him and the caiman, that would provoke it, never get between a predator and what it wants. Close enough that her hull thumped his. The boy's hands shook, but they obeyed. He picked up the tucunare, 2 kilograms, his first real catch, the proof he'd wanted, and slid it over the far gunnel. Minimal splash. Professional, almost. The caiman turned, found the tucunare floating 10 meters out, and sank with it, in one smooth, ancient motion. Gone. The piranhas swarmed the blood cloud, and the frenzy doubled. Severina grabbed the bow of Licchio's dugout and towed it west, away from the feeding, away from the caiman, away from the spot where 22 years ago her son bled into this water and didn't come home. The boy didn't speak. Hands gripping the canoe's edges, knuckles pale. But his eyes, Valdemar's eyes, were still on the water, still reading it, still hungry to understand. They reached the stilt house in silence, the kind that carried weight, loaded with everything Severina wanted to say and everything Licchio expected to hear. You're grounded. Never again. The river will kill you the way it killed your uncle. She tied both canoes, climbed the ladder, sat in her hammock. The boy followed, sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and waited for the storm. It didn't come. Instead, Severina stared at her own hands, brown, nicked, scarred in the specific pattern piranha fishing, carved into a person over decades. The crescent bite mark on her left thumb from '93, the nylon burn across her right palm that never fully healed. These hands knew the river better than her brain did, and she'd been trying to keep that knowledge locked inside a 68-year-old body that wouldn't last forever. Keeping it from the one person who'd shown he could carry it. Because carrying it meant being on the water, and the water meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of another empty hammock. Valdemar had died ignorant. That was the truth she dodged for 22 years. Not reckless, ignorant. He didn't know piranha behavior, didn't know feeding patterns, didn't know you never thrash, never splash, never enter water where fish are already excited. He didn't know because nobody taught him, because Severina herself hadn't known enough back then. She knew now. She knew everything now. And her grandson had just demonstrated the knowledge could transfer. Instincts were good, observation sharp, hands steady. He'd positioned his line exactly right, set the hook with timing she hadn't taught, handled the tucunare without being shown.
The river was in him.
Not because blood guaranteed it, Orquídea shared the same blood and hated water, because some people are made for certain things. The river chose its own. It chose Licio with the same certainty it chose Severina 60 years ago when she caught her first piranha at 8 and felt something click into place that never unclicked.
Your uncle died in that water. The frenzy point. The same spot you fished this morning.
Tiberio.
Of course, the old man with his missing fingers and his stories that changed every telling, except the one about Valdemar, which never changed. Licio sought out the story himself, not to be scared away, but to understand what went wrong, what Valdemar hadn't known, what Licio needed to know to make sure it didn't happen again.
10 years old.
And already thinking like a fisherman.
Severina reached under her hammock
And pulled out the old tackle box. Raoni's, her first husband's, Valdemar's father's, gented aluminium with a latch that stuck unless you pressed it right. Inside, hand-forged hooks in 6 sizes. Leaders rated for pirarucu, a small whetstone, and a spool of nylon worth more than most furniture in the house.
She set it on the floor between them.
Opened it. The hooks caught morning light.
These were your father's. Take the largest one.
Licio's eyes went wide.
Not fear. That particular hunger knowledge creates, the appetite that only grows when you feed it.
She taught him for 4 hours.
Piranha behavior by species. Red-bellied versus black, different aggression, different triggers. Water reading, temperature gradients, current patterns that concentrated bait fish, the surface disturbance that meant active versus resting. Safety rules. The real ones, not the television version, keep wounds above water. Never enter during active feeding. Watch for caimans at frenzy edges. Always carry a tourniquet. Always fish with someone who knows where you are.
The boy absorbed it.
The way dry soil absorbs rain. Completely, immediately, without waste. He asked questions that proved he'd been thinking about this longer than just today. Connected pieces she hadn't expected.
So Tiberio lost his fingers because he reached into the net during a feeding event. The piranhas weren't attacking him, they were going for the fish caught in the mesh, and his hand was in the way.
Severina nodded.
Exactly right. The distinction mattered. Piranhas weren't monsters, they were fish doing fish things. Understanding what those things were, and when and why they happened, was the difference between losing fingers and catching dinner.
That afternoon,
They went to the frenzy point together. 2 canoes, side by side. Severina watching the boy watch the water. Hands steady, movements deliberate. Lines placed with growing precision. He caught 3 tucunare and a matrinxa. She caught 2 pirarucu. They worked the edges in silence, communicating in paddle angles and head nods and the shared grammar of a language that had no words.
Sun dropped behind the flooded forest.
turning the Vasia gold, then copper, then deep bruised purple that meant night was 15 minutes away. Piranhas don't feed aggressively after dark. Another piece she gave him, another transfer from a body that wouldn't last forever into a mind that would carry it forward. They paddled home through water that held their reflections, grandmother and grandson. The same river that took Valdemar 22 years ago, carrying them both safely back to a stilt house where the hammocks would be full tonight.
Not because the river was safe.
It wasn't, never would be, but because the river was knowable, and knowing it was the only protection worth having. Severina learned this the hardest way possible. Now she'd teach it the right way. One cast at a time, one morning at a time, with a boy who was born to do this, and a grandmother who'd finally stopped fighting what the river already knew.
4:30 tomorrow.
2 paddles in the water, the piranhas would be feeding. And this time, 2 people would know exactly what to do about it.